Sin salida.
No way out. The expired-term Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, vehemently rejects the peace plan promoted by the White House. And not only that, Zelensky also wants a meeting in Washington with US President Donald Trump, in which European leaders openly opposed to the White House peace plan would also participate. For now, Trump is standing firm and responds, no meeting until Ukraine validates his peace plan. Zelensky, for the moment, has no way out. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 295 of Demolishing Myths Talks, completely live. Joining us from Madrid, Spain, is Mr. Fernando Moragón.
Desde Madrid, España, el señor Fernando Moragón. Hola, Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bien, aquí seguimos.
Hi, Fernando. How's everything over there? Good, good. We're still here, like you, in decrepit, decadent, and absolutely disastrous Europe, heading straight for the abyss. This is already inevitable, and we're rejoicing as we watch ourselves sink into the crap. Oops, sorry, I don't know what I was thinking. Anyway, that said, and then there's Caja Callas, priceless as always, saying no, that we have to keep fighting and all that. Anyway, we'll talk about other things now, and well, we'll have a chance to talk about how everything is evolving, how the front is evolving. Because, of course, one of the things that amuses me most about the famous 28 points, which have now been reduced to 19, is that this is all a joke. I mean, it's a farce, as I've been saying. Well, but if they say no, we have to stabilize, we have to reach an agreement, a peace agreement, and all that. If an agreement is reached, in the end, the front line has to be frozen. And what line? Today's? Tomorrow's? Well, every day it's different. The Russians advance more each day. And if there are substantial advances from one day to the next, don't even get me started on what happens from one week to another. So, what line are we going to freeze? I mean, really, this is an absolute farce. It makes no sense whatsoever. And besides, the Ukrainians have already made it clear time and again that they won't accept it. Which means this is exactly what Trump wanted with this plan. He's made a plan, as I've been saying, that's meant not to be accepted. In other words, so that the Ukrainians reject it and he can wash his hands of it. And the Russians roll out the red carpet for him and say, very good, Trump, bravo, you did great, you tried everything. But the Ukrainians and the Europeans are just terrible, and there was no way. That's where we are.
For
the moment, dear Fernando, your interpretation is the most plausible of all, because in recent days all kinds of versions have proliferated. That Zelensky was rejecting the plan, that the Europeans were supporting it and starting the war on their own, that Trump was finally changing his position, that, on the contrary, Trump was doubling down on his stance and Zelensky was endorsing the plan, that Russia was rejecting everything, that Russia was approving everything, one after another. Here, the latest version, at least from the Ukrainian side, is Zelensky's most recent statement, according to which the 28-point plan was completely abandoned. But Trump has already responded to this. Let's go step by step through a bit of this story. Hello, Ukrainian citizens. Today our negotiators returned from Geneva after talks with the US side, as well as with the European side, which, by the way, I'll add this myself, did not participate. They wanted to take part, but the little flags were clear. On one side, the US flag, on the other, Ukraine's. He sent the Ukrainian to the US side and put the Europeans in a separate room. Anyway, here he emphasizes Europe's supposed participation.
A little bit more.
After these meetings, the steps to end the war finally became achievable. From that point on, many of the plan's points, which no longer has 28 points, were agreed upon.
Still, however, we have a lot of work to do together.
It's a very big challenge, and we have to do everything calmly.
We appreciate that everyone is helping us and that the Americans are doing so constructively, practically throughout the entire day yesterday.
It was marked by extensive meetings with the Americans. Today, by contrast, was filled with meetings with our European allies. I spoke first with the President of Finland, then with the President of Lithuania, with the President of the European Council, and with the Prime Ministers of Norway and Spain.
Y con los primeros ministros de Noruega y de España. Agradezco a todos ellos el apoyo.
I thank all of them for the support they have given.
Ukraine is not alone, and that is very important.
Our team reported that the new draft is almost ready today, but there are still a few details to adjust before presenting it officially.
It's ready, and I'm going to discuss the sensitive points of this new document with President Trump. Ukraine will never be an obstacle to peace. That's our principle. Millions of Ukrainians are counting on us and deserve a dignified peace. Well, this is Zelensky's statement from just a short while ago. However, Trump, at the White House, attention, this Trump at the White House, with a turkey, in a ceremony ahead of Thanksgiving Day so popular over there, as a display of Zelensky's words.
The Nobel Peace Prize for the turkey. What is this?
Why not?
Attention.
Are you ready?
Are you ready?
Talking with the turkey.
Gable, aparentemente el nombre del coso, solo quiero decirte...
Gable, apparently the name of the thing. I just want to give you this very important news. Here, by the authority granted to me by the Constitution, I hereby declare you, through this act, totally and completely pardoned. The turkey replies, "Long live the Lord, long live the Lord, praise be to the Lord."
Viva el Señor, alabado sea el Señor.
Well, it's nice. Who would want to harm this beautiful bird?
Y tocándolo ahí, manoseando.
And touching it there, handling it. Oh, how beautiful it is. Who could hurt it? Who could want to hurt this beautiful bird? Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, little white one, but let's see.
Ay, Dios, otra vez. Atención, acá el perdón.
Gobble. I just...
Attention, here comes forgiveness.
Praise the Lord.
And there.
They just spared his life, so of course he's aware of the situation.
They just spared his life, so of course he'd say, well, I'd say the same thing.
On Sundays, they've just spared my life and aren't going to eat me. On Thanksgiving Day, they're going to carve me up, brutally.
Here, in the press room there, with Caroline Levitt, his daughter. Oh, well, of course, this is the second part. They're going to appoint him as Trump's advisor, right? Sent to Ukraine.
Well, I'm sure they give better advice than many of the advisors they have. Look, look, look there. See how it is.
Ukraine. Well, this is kind of a joke, like a demonstration. All of this is real, nothing from the internet. But it serves a bit as context for the situation at the White House. After that, the following. An American publication, the New York Post, published the following. Trump's post on Truth Social about Ukraine surprises Zelensky's top advisor, who is pushing for the peace deal at Mar-a-Lago. President Trump dashed hopes of achieving a breakthrough at a peace summit this week to end the nearly 4-year war with Russia. In just an instant, the Ukrainian president's chief advisor, Andriy Yermak, was in the middle of an interview with the New York Post on Tuesday when Trump posted on Truth Social that he was sending Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll to meet with the Ukrainians and presidential envoy Steve Bitkov to Moscow to continue talks toward a peace deal. This effectively slowed down his earlier goal of ending the killings by Thanksgiving. Specifically, Yermak had just spent the last half hour telling the outlet that he hoped the 19-point proposal, the new one, just announced by Zelensky to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, drafted on Sunday, would be adopted as a joint plan between the United States and Ukraine. Ideally, with Trump and Zelensky signing the agreement at Mar-a-Lago during the Thanksgiving holiday.
El feriado de Acción de Gracias. Dicho de otra manera, quería Zelensky una...
In other words, Zelensky wanted a meeting with Trump. He had just announced it in his own address for the signing of this agreement, a revised document rejecting all the main points. And suddenly, Trump's announcement that he's going to send his new anti-Ukrainian representative, this Mr. Driscoll, instead of the very pro-Ukrainian Kellogg. Exactly. And on the other hand, the announcement that he would also send Bitkov to Moscow to hold a meeting with Putin. All of this, once again, caused desperation in Ukraine and in Europe. With all these back and forths, Fernando, what's the reality of all this?
Look, it's easy to just watch. Let's see. Thanksgiving wants to bring you together with Trump, who's there with the turkey and all that mess. He's going to say no. I mean, come on. It's true. And besides, what's he going to meet with you for? So Trump can put on another circus like he did when he was, can't remember if it was in March or so, when he was at the White House and put on that whole show with the Vice President Vance, and they tore him apart. But they've already been told, look, the new special envoy replacing Kellogg, Driscoll, according to the information, told Yermak and company, that's another thing. We've got a guy who's negotiating, and we don't know how long he'll last because he's getting more and more caught up in the corruption scandal. So he doesn't have much authority. Apparently. But well, what does it matter? Since all of this is a circus, a farce, a theatrical performance, everything is absolutely meaningless. Well, this guy basically said, look, you're getting lost, you're going to go out there and lose, so don't fool yourselves. And the longer you take to surrender, because this is clearly a disguised surrender, called a peace agreement, negotiation, and so on. No, it's a surrender. The longer you take to surrender, the worse the conditions will be, and the more territory you'll lose. Don't be idiots. That's exactly what he said, just like that. So, well, let's see. This is simply a few things. One, Trump is actually doing quite well, shifting the focus. We were once again dealing with what is right now the sword of Damocles keeping Trump awake every night, which isn't Ukraine, not even China or the Middle East. It's something internal. Epstein. The Epstein scandal, which keeps growing, and he just can't shake off. I mean, he shows up in all sorts of places and seems increasingly involved in all the messes that man had going on. So what does he do? He shifts the focus and, boom, he directs all the media attention to Ukraine. And that way, at least temporarily, he gets rid of the constant statements and leaks from all sides because he changes the focus. Trump is really good at this, we have to admit. So, they had already prepared the ground beforehand. The groundwork had been laid with those two anti-corruption organizations in Ukraine, which were created by the United States, are completely controlled by the United States, and had never done anything until this year. As we mentioned very quickly, he tried, seeing that they were already getting involved, meaning the Americans had activated it, they had been sitting idle. They activated it and said, go ahead. They started tackling corruption right away. Zelensky tried to strip them of all the powers and authority they had to investigate and such, from a legal standpoint through parliament and so on. The Americans staged a mini Maidan for him, and he quickly had to backtrack and return all the powers to those organizations. First warning, and now comes the second one, and it's important. We're coming for you. In other words, they're now exposing a corruption scandal that involves everyone. Practically everyone who matters. In other words, not a single one is spared. Among them, Yerbak. From there, we have a government that's increasingly weakened, facing the most internally challenged corruption scandal since the regime itself, which is important. And they sit down to negotiate when it's not even clear anymore who's in charge in Ukraine. But anyway, what's true? Since all of this is a farce, well, German meets with Marco Rubio, then there's a meeting between the head of the the GUR, I think it is, and the Russian intelligence services in the United Arab Emirates. It was in Dubai, I think, or maybe it just happened, where the American joins in afterward and so on. The Russians saying, let's see about those 28 points, if in the end they've been passed to us, more or less officially. But not much more than that. And as for the 19, we still don't have confirmation. We don't know which ones they are. I mean, this is what the Russians are saying. Sakov himself mentioned it today, saying, well, fine, when it gets to us, we'll talk. And everyone repeating, in this case the Russians, that Trump is great, wonderful, thank you very much for your services. But of course, this has to be negotiated. This is just a starting point. And from there are elements that don't add up. Elements we need to go into detail about, which is a diplomatic way of saying, look, we can drag this out negotiating for as long as you want. Which deep down is what I believe, that both sides in this case, Russians and Americans alike, have their own reasons. That is, to drag out the negotiation process, create as many negotiations as needed, and say if one fails, so to speak, well, we'll just invent another one, we'll meet in Alaska, we'll meet wherever. In other words, it doesn't matter. The point is to put on a show, which is what Trump has been doing from the start. Let's not forget, ever since Trump picks up the phone, calls Putin, and says, let's start talking, and so on, the whole negotiation process, if you can even call it that, can be summed up as absolutely nothing. Empty. Nothing has come of it. Nothing has been done. Sure, there's been a lot of fuss, a lot of theatrics, lots of meetings, for nothing. And of the famous 28 points, which no one talks about, there's one that's very important. That is to say, that's the key to all of this, or one of the keys to all of this. To relaunch economic relations between Russia and the United States, which is really what they want. As I've been saying, Trump couldn't care less about Ukraine, not one bit. What he wants is to re-establish economic relations with the Russians, because he needs to. We've talked about this many times already, about rare earths and so on. So, the problem he has is that he doesn't possess the absolute power that monarchs had under the old regime, more or less. He faces external opposition, the weaker one, the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and internal opposition, the stronger one, the one he has to fight the most, which comes from the Democrats, and above all, from the Republican Party that isn't pro-Trump, which is the majority. Some of them are even within his own administration, like Marco Rubio. That is, he's not a Trumpist. That's why he has to make these twists and turns. One moment it's business, then it's not. One moment Putin is a great guy, then he's terrible. One moment he imposes sanctions, then he doesn't. One moment he sends the tomahawks, then he doesn't anymore. In other words, he has to keep playing with it. For what purpose? To buy time. So that the Russians can finish the job and present a policy of accomplished facts in which they've already lost. And then he can stand before the Democrats and Republicans in the United States and say, look, it's over. You've already lost. Let's focus on something else, which is what Trump is interested in. And that's what they're doing. I mean, that's why all these negotiations, as I've been saying from the start, with all the ones that have taken place, and all of them correctly assessed, are going nowhere. They end in nothing. Because they're designed to end in nothing. In other words, there's no intention for this to be a real negotiation. What Trump has done with the 28 points and what he's playing with is already presenting Zelensky and company with the plain, harsh reality. Gentlemen, the 28 points are nothing. They euphemistically disguise it as this is a peace plan and so on. No, this is not a peace plan. This is a surrender plan. It's different. A surrender plan in which we've included a few points just to distract, so it doesn't look too blatant. But we know they won't lead anywhere. I mean, like saying the Ukrainian army has 600,000, we'll have 600,000 men. That part's a joke, right? Then the Europeans come along with an even greater sense of humor and say, no, 800,000, come on, cheer up. Why not 1.5 million? What harm could it do? I mean, when the Russians are saying that more than 85,000, nothing. And on top of that with light weapons, meaning no real armament. But well, they include that so it's not too obvious that they're on the Russian side, but because it suits Trump and his people. And because in addition, in that case, they really do have a much greater degree of realism than the rest. That is, the war is indeed lost. So what Trump is looking for is a way out of this war. And there the Russians, the great favor they do him, is to say, all right, fine, we'll accept you. We already know you're part of the war. In fact, you were the ones who started it. But since we can blame Biden and the Democrats, fine, we'll accept your role as mediator and offer you an elegant way out of the war. In the end, you'll be able to come out saying that you tried everything, but you were sabotaged, they refused to cooperate, and in the end, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the non-Trumpist Republicans who are advocating for the war didn't want to make a deal. They're the majority, right? I mean, on the other hand, and that's it. That's how things are. And meanwhile, while they keep putting on a show, the Russians are moving at breakneck speed. At this rate, well, we'll see. But the Ukrainians won't make it through this winter. The situation is really bad, and the Americans told them yesterday, and all of them know it anyway. In other words, this can't go on any longer. There aren't enough troops, there's no capacity, the front is broken and can't be rebuilt. Anyway, we'll talk about it in more detail later. But no, these aren't real negotiations. These are, let's say, peace negotiations. These, in any case, are surrender negotiations, which is different. That is, the Russians are also taking it extremely calmly because they keep saying, no, this is all fine and everything, but I still have my list, the one Putin presented in June of last year, stating which points must be met. And it's still the same, meaning if the Ukrainians accept it, fine. If not, well, we go through the motions and keep talking, negotiating, and so on, chatting about soccer, whatever it takes. But this is how it is. Take it or leave it. If you take it, you surrender. Fine, we can call it a peace treaty or a peace agreement, whatever you want. But you surrender. And if not, we're going to defeat you, and you'll have to accept it too. So this is how it is. There's nothing more to it.
Here's Trump, also in recent statements about the peace plan, in this back and forth of progress and setbacks. Attention. Yes, why not? Now then, in recent days, 25,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers have died in the war.
Well, the usual rant before any statement on the subject. I think we're very close to an agreement. We'll see.
That's why I think we're getting very close to an agreement. We'll see it in the coming days, but we're getting very close. We would have liked it to happen faster, but well, that's the situation. But we're getting very close. These are Trump's statements, while shortly after CNN presented this. Here, the United States proclaims progress in the talks with Ukraine, but a source reveals significant obstacles. And what are the main obstacles? First, the delicate question of whether Ukraine would hand over key territories in the Donbas region. First obstacle.
En segundo lugar, la controvertida
Secondly, the controversial US proposal for Ukraine to limit the size of its army to 600,000 troops, a figure included in the 28-point plan. Apparently, according to CNN, Ukraine does not want that 600,000 troop limit. And thirdly, finally, regarding Ukraine's renunciation of its ambition to become a NATO member, the source told CNN that this demand remains unacceptable. Therefore, despite Trump's words, according to US media, there has been some progress, but disagreements remain over territories, demilitarization and neutrality in relation to NATO. Regarding those three small insignificant details, small details.
Pequeños detalles sin importancia sí, que no van a ningún lado. Es decir,
They're not going anywhere, of course. That's why it was funny, of course. No, there have been advances, yes. No, well, sure, yes. It's like if I say every day we're closer to the end of the year, right? It's the same thing. I mean, as the days go by, we're closer to the end of the year. Well, this is the same. We're closer to the end of the war. Of course, all wars end. Now, they end in very different ways, but there have been advances and so on. Besides, well, this has a certain meaning. And it's known that in that meeting between Marco Rubio and Yermak, there was more than just tension.
Entre Marco Rubio y Yermak hubo más que tiranteces. Es decir, bueno, pero luego hay que salir haciendo el pari.
That is to say, well, but then you have to keep up the pretense and say, no, there have been advances and so on. No, there hasn't been any real progress. In fact, Yermak later said that Ukraine is not giving up, does not intend to give up on joining NATO in the future. Well, you tell me that's exactly what you were pointing out. So you say, well, this is all smoke. It's all smoke. In fact, the Russians complained about something quite amusing at this meeting they had in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai and so on. I think it was in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi, whatever. That is, it was supposed to be a meeting between Russians and Ukrainians. Let's see. The Russians and Ukrainians meet periodically, among other things, to deal with issues like prisoner exchanges, the return of the dead, and so on. So nothing new. I mean, let's not think, they managed to get the heads of the intelligence services from both sides to meet. They've met many times. That is to say, but, well, the American joined in to give the meeting more, let's say, weight, and the Russians were left saying, and this guy, he's not invited, what's he doing here? Referring to the American, what's his name?
Refiriéndose al norteamericano, al ¿cómo se llama? El no me acuerdo.
That I don't remember.
Driscoll, al Driscoll este. Bueno, pues al Driscoll.
Driscoll, with a D, Driscoll, that Driscoll guy. Well, that Driscoll guy who's a bit of a Driscollo. What a terrible joke, but anyway. So he said he's coming here. Well, all of this is just staging. And the Russians, as I said, you listen to the statements from Lavrov, from Ushakov, from everyone who's been speaking, and they all say the same thing. That, well, first, they only knew about the 28 points through the press, basically, but that through the official channel where things are supposed to be done, nothing had reached them. So there's nothing to say. It seems that now they have received them. It's not clear whether officially or unofficially, so to speak. But anyway. And then they say that they don't know anything about those 19 points. Officially. Then when they get them, they'll see what's in there. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as we don't know these 19 points. At least I haven't seen them. They said, no, we've done this and that, but they haven't said what came of it. It's probably nothing. I mean, come on, it's just a summary, a contribution to something else. But anyway, the situation is so clear, so obvious that you think there's nothing left to negotiate. When negotiations really should have happened, well, and they did happen, but the Europeans, the British, and the Americans ruined them, was in March 2022. From that point on, it was over. That's when Mr. Boris Johnson frustrated the negotiations with his famous trip to Kiev and his "to the last Ukrainian" remark. There, when the Russians were also willing to make extraordinary concessions, Now they won't make a single one. In fact, at the pace this is going, they'd better hurry, because next month it's going to fall. It's going to be very close. That is, if you look, it will have fallen too. In fact, they're already inside and have entered from the south, from the east, and from the north, and quite a bit more. Pokrovsk will probably be Pokrovsk, or rather Pokrovsk, which will also be on its last legs if it hasn't fallen already. And of course, what's left of Minograd, which is very little, that's already done for, and the Russians will move on to something else. In other words, it's collapsing.
Es que está colapsando, pero que es que los propios ucranianos lo están diciendo. Están diciendo que el sistema.
But the Ukrainians themselves are saying it. They're saying that the energy system can't take it anymore. It just can't. That in the latest bombings, one of the things that got destroyed besides the electrical system were the gas pipelines. That they no longer have gas. That they're completely dependent on European gas. Keep in mind, Ukraine used to be a gas exporter. And the situation has gotten so bad that for some time now the pipelines have been reversed. And it's Europe that's been supplying gas to the Ukrainians. Well, now even that is practically gone. They've got nothing left. Those famous images we saw the other day of the Kiev metro in darkness, the situation is critical.
La situación es crítica.
Ahora, Fernando, los líderes europeos.
Now, Fernando, the European leaders, in open disconnection from reality, reject this and, first of all, create pressure to push for changes in Trump's peace plan. But secondly, and more covertly, they also begin to float the idea of leading the war against Russia without US support. Here the peace plan starts to unravel. We can later present Mertz's statements, then some articles, and deliberate among ourselves about this possibility.
Well, we have to tell our demolishers that we're now moving into our usual segment, which is the comedy segment. In other words, we're now entering the European comedy moment, right? It's always like this.
Here's the always flirtatious Kaya. Today, oh how she's coming today.
Good morning. We just met with the Ministers of Defense via video conference to discuss the latest developments.
Regarding the war with Russia.
Also joined us online to brief from the situation.
Ukraine's Foreign Minister, Kuleba, also joined us to give an overview of the situation from the Ukrainian side.
Or regarding the situation from Ukrainian side.
It's important that we continue supporting Ukraine and putting pressure on Russia. That's what we will keep doing. We all want this war to end.
Push for peace. We all want this war to end.
We all welcome the United States' push for peace.
We all want this war to end.
But it really matters how this war ends.
We must remember that there is only one aggressor and one victim.
It must be the first step to ending the war, but right now
an immediate and unconditional ceasefire must be the first step to end the war.
But for the moment, we see no indication that Russia is ready for a ceasefire. Russia is not stopping its war machine, but strengthening it.
To negotiate to a situation where they need to negotiate.
We must move from a situation in which Russia pretends to negotiate to one in which Russia actually negotiates.
But we are slowly getting to that situation.
US and EU sanctions.
We're getting to that point because the Russian summer offensive failed. The sanctions from the United States and the European Union are having a tremendous impact on the Russian economy. Both Russia's economy and its energy revenues are noticeably declining. Russia is losing money and soldiers, and that increases the chances of moving toward peace.
debemos incrementar también la presión contra Rusia.
We must also increase the pressure on Russia.
Losing is also flat out false.
La noción de
The notion that Ukraine is losing is blatantly false. This message is directed straight at you, Fernando.
Este mensaje
Sí,
ahí,
sí,
directo a vos.
If Russia could conquer Ukraine militarily, it would have already done so.
If Russia could have conquered Ukraine militarily, it would have done so already.
His way there. To secure,
Putin no está pudiendo.
Putin is not managing to achieve his goals through military means, so he will try to reach them through negotiations.
A través de las negociaciones para lograr el mejor resultado para Ucrania y Europa,
To achieve the best outcome for Ukraine and Europe, we must stay on the same course.
more sanctions to deprive Russia of the means to fight.
solo debemos aumentar la velocidad. Eso sí.
We just need to increase the pace. That means more sanctions on Russia to deprive it of its means of combat, and more military and financial support for Ukraine. Well, in the Council of the European Union, we already promised to cover all of Ukraine's military and economic expenses for 2026 and 2027. And why not later on as well, right?
¿Por qué no más adelante aún también, no?
Más allá, de hecho, a ver...
Later on, yes.
No sé qué opinas,
In fact, let's see, I don't know what you think, Ezequiel, about my beautiful mane I have here, which is wonderful. Yes, yes. Oh, right, I don't have a mane. Oh, that I don't live in reality. Well, that's exactly what's happening to this lady. This speech is delusional. I mean, first, we're going to put pressure on Russia. Fine by me, go ahead and pressure them. With what? Militarily, they'll die laughing. You're terrified and not willing to send a single soldier because you know, first, that you'd be defeated, and second, that if you try to mobilize young people to send them there, by reinstating mandatory military service, the young people will run the other way and you'll end up with no youth left. That's going to start. But the thing is, Scott Bessent, who isn't exactly suspicious of... But Putin, Scott Bessent already said the other day, look, here's the thing. Something that's been done 19 times. Sanctions that have already been imposed 19 times and haven't achieved anything. Imposing more is a failure. In other words, this is going nowhere. Stop imposing sanctions if they don't work. Scott Bessent already told you the sanctions you can impose, the Russians are laughing their heads off. So now, I don't know, maybe you can sanction, what can I say, Russian zoos or something like that, because there's nothing important left in Russia that can be sanctioned. Anyway, these people live in complete unreality because I think people like Kalash actually believe it, which is the serious part. If they didn't believe it, but they do. And I'll mention two things, mind you, not suspicious ones. This famous Driscoll guy. This comes from NBC News, which is neither pro-Putin nor pro-Russian. NBC News reports that in a meeting with Ukrainian officials in Kiev last week, the U.S. Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, stated that Ukrainian troops are facing a difficult situation on the battlefield and will suffer an inevitable defeat against Russian forces. Driscoll told them that the Russians are increasing the scale and pace of their air attacks, and that the Russians are capable of fighting indefinitely. The situation in Ukraine over time will only get worse, Driscoll continued. And it's better to negotiate a peace deal now than to find oneself in an even weaker position in the future. The U.S. delegation also stated that the American defense industry will not be able to continue supplying Ukraine with weapons and air defense systems in the volumes needed to protect the country's infrastructure and population. And I'm saying this now because they don't have the industrial capacity for it. That is to say, to make it clear. As for Mrs. Callas, who lives, well, let's say Mrs. Callas in World War II in 1945 in April, would have been saying that the Germans were going to win the war in April, right? The war ended in May.
Pues esta señora Calas. Sí, todo lo que ha dicho es
I mean, this lady Calas, everything she said is delusional. So, well, let me tell you something else, nothing suspicious. In a BBC report, the BBC, right? We're not talking about anything pro-Putin. They did a report on training camps, you know, the training of Ukrainians in Poland. This is the Europe that wants to defeat Russia. Pay attention to this. So the Ukrainians arrived there to train, to be instructed, among other things, in drone operations. And well, the Ukrainians arrived and said, there with Polish, Czech, and other instructors and so on. But what are you telling us? You're not preparing or you don't want to train for a war that no longer exists. That is to say, for a war from years ago, from decades ago. You're in bad shape. To the point that if you don't know how to handle drones, it had to be the Ukrainians in the end who acted as instructors for the Europeans, telling them, look, we're going to explain to you what modern warfare is like, what drone warfare is like, what the operational challenges are because you're being watched from all sides and so on. It had to be the Ukrainians who trained the instructors. This gives you an idea of where Europe lives, somewhere in the fifth galaxy.
Es decir, en la quinta galaxia. Bien, pues bueno, claro, así la señora Calas dice lo que...
Well, all right, sure. That's why Mrs. Callas says what she says. But that's it. Disconcert has made it very clear to the Ukrainians, you're gonna lose. And the longer you keep fooling around, the more you're gonna lose. That is, the more territory the Russians will keep, and the harsher the conditions will be. And I'm saying it in advance, okay? That is, the Russians are definitely going to keep, of course, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, well, we've already talked about that, and Kherson. But they're also going to keep Sumy, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Odessa, and maybe a few more. This is more than clear.
Esto es más que claro. Y lo vamos a ver, quiero decir, porque...
And we're going to see it. I mean, because in the end, what we're going to see is a surrender in a disastrous situation, an almost unconditional surrender of the Ukrainians and of the Europeans, who have nothing to fight with. They don't even have money. And that's why they're trying to steal the money that's deposited in Belgium, in Euroclear, the money they stole from the Russians, from the Russian National Bank, because they no longer know where to get money from. Because let's not forget one thing. While the Russian economy is fairly sound, this doesn't mean it has no problems. It's fairly sound. The European economy isn't sound, or even slightly sound. It's in free fall. In other words, you're in no position to do anything. You're not even capable of managing your own countries. Perhaps the clearest example is Macron, who, while playing at war in Ukraine, well, playing at war in theory, not in practice, has a country on the verge of bankruptcy. And at some point it's going to erupt with protests that will end up cutting off Macron's head, like in the French Revolution. That's the kind of situation these people live in.
On this tour through Europe, here are the reports from the European press. Fernando, while I present this, could you leave the session and restart it using the same link? Because there's constant interference, a little noise like before. If you could restart your computer, your PC, even better. To me, there's interference, something plugged in wrong, maybe a loose connection. But anyway, if not, at least leave the session and start it again with the same link while I present this.
Vale. Venga, va.
And, by the way, Politico, not exactly suspected of being pro-Russian, says that Vitkov needs a psychiatrist. Europeans are furious about Trump's plan to profit from frozen Russian assets. Diplomats and officials are reacting with outrage to the new details of the US peace plan, warning that it could undermine their efforts to help Ukraine survive the war. Furious Europeans, according to Politico. Over here, more from the same outlet. Pay attention to this. Over here. Meanwhile, Mr. Fernando Moragón has already reappeared.
Let's see, how do I sound now?
1, 2, este es el plan A.
Testing, 1, 2, testing, 1, 2. And now without the interference. Before, your sound was very loud and clear, but with a bit of interference, some noise every now and then. Now it's gone. Here, Politico again. The countries of the European Union are urgently seeking a plan B to finance Ukraine. Authorities are considering an EU bridge loan to help Kiev stay afloat if they fail to reach an agreement in time on the use of Moscow's frozen state assets. Once again, the Europeans' desperation is reported by a pro-European, anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian outlet, clearly and openly.
De manera clara y abierta.
And here's another one, before we present the actual words of Merz and Macron. Here again, Politico as well, with attention here. 5 reasons. This is perhaps the most concerning part. When they start, subtly, to introduce the idea of the war continuing without the United States. 5 reasons why Ukraine will keep fighting even if Trump leaves. If the US administration withdraws weapons, continuing to fight would be difficult, but not impossible for Ukraine. And pay attention, Fernando, here are the 5 points.
It makes me burst out laughing.
The politician analyzed 5 key issues raised by Trump's ultimatum and what they mean for Ukraine's war effort. First key issue, can Europe simply replace the United States? Their own answer, right? No, not in the short term and not at the level Ukraine needs. Well, we're not going to answer is already quite clear. We're not going to add more arguments here, because if they themselves determine that no, if the people who don't, second, how important is intelligence sharing? This, because of Trump's threat to abandon immediate military support, and above all, to abandon intelligence support. And here the answer in summary. Europe could, over time, build more satellites and reconnaissance aircraft, but it would take years just to meet the capacity goals of European nations, let alone help Ukraine. Oh, how funny this is, guys. Well, third issue. Here too, our intervention is unnecessary.
What for? They already say it themselves. They make fools of themselves.
Well, number 3. Isn't Europe already spending more than the United States? Nowadays, Europe is clearly spending more than the United States in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean it has control. Instead of providing weapons, the United States sells them and gets its allies to cover the cost according to Ukraine's list of priority requirements. But that doesn't give Europe any real control. An expert named Merling stated that the deeper problem is that Washington no longer treats defense agreements as fixed contracts. The United States is increasingly behaving like a partner that feels free to rewrite the terms when the political tone changes, leaving Europeans exposed. So here, the answer is at least partly negative. Europe is spending more, yes, but even so, the situation is unsustainable for Europe alone. Number 4. Will the United States really stop selling weapons to Ukraine? An expert named Skripchenko argued that commercial logic opposes a total suspension. This Ukrainian reserve fund has $3.5 billion in pledges, and that's a lot of money for US defense companies to ignore. I don't think the United States will stop selling them weapons at a European price. Well, okay, the United States is not going to abandon arms sales out of convenience. A more or less solid argument on their part. And number 5, could Ukraine keep fighting without the United States? Attention, Ukraine could keep fighting, but the war would immediately enter a much more vulnerable and unpredictable phase. Russia has been losing thousands of men per week in its slow offensive, and the Ukrainian army has managed to exact a bloody toll thanks to its drone technology and the greater number of artillery shells it now possesses. In 3 years, we have transformed a small sector of the defense industry. Blah, blah, blah. But nevertheless, Ukraine's resilience is not in doubt. Skripchenko highlighted how Ukraine has remained in the fight, even during the severe shortage of air defense interceptors, ammunition, and other weapons, and despite the constant bombardment of Russian missiles, bombs, and drones. The country has neither capitulated nor fallen, he said, a sign that Ukrainian forces will continue to resist, even if Trump withdraws.
Incluso si Trump se retira.
Madre mía. El último es de traca. Quiero decir, el último es...
My goodness, the last one is unbelievable.
Vamos.
I mean, the last one is honestly beyond words. Let's see. If Trump cuts off their intelligence support, then they can sell all the weapons they want, right? The war would be over. Because they depend completely on intelligence in the broad sense. When I say intelligence, I mean everything those satellites provide them, which, as the article says, would take Europeans, well, you know, building a satellite, launching it, and all that takes time. So, in the best-case scenario, it would take 15 years at least to match American capabilities if we actually tried, and we don't have the money for that. But anyway, what does it matter? I mean, without intelligence, Ukraine wouldn't last a week, because it would be blind and deaf. That is to say, the one providing information about the battlefield, where the Russians are and what they're doing, is the United States, through its satellites. The one providing the GPS signal is the United States. The one providing communications is the United States, for example, through Starlink. In other words, everything depends on them. The one determining and locating targets and guiding Ukrainian long-range drones toward those targets is the United States. That is to say, they can't do anything without the United States. So forget it. If the United States... Well, another thing is if they actually cut them off. I don't think they would cut them off completely. They'd just put on a show. But anyway, because it's in their interest to keep bleeding the Russians.
The article is contradictory, because for all the conditions they answered no, except for the last one. We could do it alone anyway. But well, in all the others they themselves had answered no. Here's Merck's, Fernando, once again. Oh, by the way, demolishers. 1,600 connected and fewer than 1,000 likes. Please help us out. This helps us fight censorship. Remember that. Here's Merck's in the German parliament. This one has no subtitles, so I'm sharpening my ear in German a bit. Pay attention to the words of the disgraceful Merz. Less and less popular, and precisely because of that, with an increasingly xenophobic, more racist speech, as a way to win back conservative votes in Germany. But he can't even manage that, right? For real and genuine negotiations to be possible, we must first show Putin that continuing the war is useless.
Llevar adelante la guerra es inútil.
Wir werden in unserer Unterstützung der Ukraine nicht nachlassen.
Y por eso le decimos, no vamos a ceder en nuestra...
And that's why we say we will not waver in our support for Ukraine.
And that's why we're going to help the Ukrainian people as much as they need.
Y por eso queremos poner a disposición...
And that's why we want to make Russia's frozen funds available to Ukraine. And Putin has to realize, we have to make him understand, that he cannot wage this war on the shoulders of European taxpayers. Well, we're not going to abandon our support for the Ukrainians. And we have to make Putin see that war is not a good business for him. And finally, Macron, in an interview today, Today's Russia, saying, I have something already translated here. Because without knowing French, unfortunately, saying some outrageous things, and on top of that with that same stupid face as always, right? Yes. But well, he can't help his own face. That's his face, yes.
It's just that before he went out to speak, his wife, Brigitte, had given him a few slaps, and so, of course, the man came out all red-faced.
Yes, yes, the slightly sunburned shoulders. Well, here are the outrageous things said. He's asking me for a shot of his money. Attention, Russia no longer builds schools, no longer builds hospitals, it has no social policy whatsoever. It produces submarines, missiles, tanks, and finances armies from third countries to send them to the Ukrainian front or to threaten us Europeans again and again. It has a whole arsenal of weapons, and we are within range of its intercontinental missiles. We are all exposed to that. That is the reality of the threat. We would be making a mistake by showing weakness in the face of this threat. We must show that the French are not weak. A declaration of open war, and this idea of it doesn't build schools, it builds submarines and missiles.
Construye escuelas, construye submarinos y misiles.
Fíjate lo absurdo de los argumentos de unos y otros. Primero,
the absurdity of the arguments on both sides. First, MERS, we're going to support Ukraine until the end, and so on. That's all well and good, but with what? Because they don't specify. I mean, with what? What are you going to do? Specifically, are you going to send troops? What are you going to do? I mean, tell me, no, we're going to support Ukraine, and we're going to take the frozen funds. Well, first negotiate with the Belgians, who have already said absolutely not, that they flatly refuse. But anyway, these are loud, empty statements saying, no, we're going to support Ukraine until the end, and so on. But tell me how. Because they don't even have money for that anymore. Tell me how. Well, and then Macron comes along to say even more nonsense if that's possible. But let's see. Let's try to follow his reasoning, if you can call it that. The Russians have cannons, tanks, weapons everywhere. They produce weapons in large quantities, but of course, in exchange, they can't build schools or hospitals or anything like that. Okay, wars. Sorry, I'm following his reasoning. An absurd point, but fine. That is, wars aren't won with hospitals or schools. They're won with armies. That is to say, assuming, which is not the case, that France and the rest of the Europeans had plenty of schools and hospitals, which, as I said, is not the case, but anyway, since they don't have armies, then tell me how they're going to defeat the Russians. Honestly, it's just, I don't know what these people are on. Well, actually, I do know what they're on, because we already saw that Macron has the same tastes as Zelensky, right? But anyway, these absurd, contradictory, ridiculous statements. Well, Mr. Macron, fine, the Russians don't have schools, they don't have anything, and what are you going to do? Oh no, they don't tell you that. Or they speculate and say, no, in the future no one knows when, sometime, somewhere, and so on. We'll do something we haven't even defined. We'll send troops when the war is over as peacekeeping forces. But of course, if the war is already over, well, I don't know. When the Russians have conquered all of Ukraine, what are you going to send them for? I mean, it's absurd. So, well, this is Europe completely disconnected from reality, which I think ends up falling into its own lies and is now in a critical situation. Because in the end, what's behind all this? Why are Europeans so determined to fight against the Russians? Well, to fight through the Ukrainians with the Russians and all that. Because victory, let's never forget this, it must be emphasized, Russia's victory over Ukraine is not a victory of Russia over Ukraine. It's a victory of Russia over NATO. Then that defeat would mean the disappearance of NATO. Trump doesn't really care much about that, because he's quite anti-NATO. But the Europeans would lose a key setup, since behind NATO's collapse would come the fall of the European Union, which has now practically turned into a military organization. In fact, they're trying to create almost their own army. I mean, this is the real reason. Aside from the craziness, incompetence, and all that from these guys, and their lack of connection with reality, their little setup is coming to an end. The European elite setup is coming to an end. The daylight robbery they were committing and still are is coming to an end. Because, of course, now there's a lot of talk about Ukrainian corruption, with everything that's come out of the Ministry of Energy and so on. But there's a second part you haven't mentioned, which is the corruption of the Europeans regarding the war in Ukraine. and what they're pocketing from that amount of money for which there's no clear accounting, to put it mildly. In fact, the Hungarians have come out saying they're going to demand the accounts to find out where it went, how it went, and what the money sent to Ukraine was spent on. And of course, if they really do that, an enormous amount of corruption is going to come to light. Because these people, let's not forget, this elite, this European political class, which is absolutely corrupt and decadent, lives off theft, both direct and indirect theft. Legal theft is, for example, Mrs. von der Leyen's salary for being the president of the European Commission, which is outrageous. Or the members of the European Parliament, which is another absurdity. And then there's the illegal part. The illegal part is all the corruption that exists in absolutely all European institutions, which are stealing hand over fist. And that's why they live so well. Of course, their gravy train is coming to an end. Ukraine's defeat is the defeat of this corrupt and utterly disgraceful Europe. And that's why they have to fight to the end. Because for them, for this political elite, it's existential. Not for the citizens. Not for the citizens. Hopefully we can get rid of this rabble, this pack of scoundrels. But for them, it's existential. And they are therefore willing to make any sacrifice, meaning the sacrifice of European citizens, not their own. And let's not forget that on top of that, they have to cover things up somehow, find a pretext, and Russia is the only one they can come up with to justify the absolute economic disaster that Europe has been led into. Those famous 19 sanction packages have sunk Europe completely. It's in free fall. It's something extraordinary, something never seen before. I'll give you just one fact. This, published by Bild, which is neither pro-Putin nor pro-Russian, says the following. German cities are sounding the alarm. Almost 1 in 3 is on the verge of bankruptcy, writes Bild. Due to the industrial crisis caused by the Germans and Europeans themselves, municipal revenues are decreasing, while expenses, especially for social needs, continue to rise. According to the report, Berlin's budget deficit amounts to 4.3 billion euros. Cologne's 600 million, Düsseldorf's 400 million, and Dortmund's more than 300 million. The overall deficit of German cities and municipalities reached 30 billion euros. This is the result of the extraordinary and brilliant management of Mr. Scholz, the former chancellor, and now Mr. Merz. This is Europe's reality. It's bankrupt. These gentlemen have wrecked the European economy. And of course, they need to find someone else to blame, the Russians. That's the reality. And of course, these gentlemen want to keep their privileges, and, well, they have to find a way. They don't know how to do it, and therefore have to try to make us believe that the Russians are our bitter enemies, that they're going to conquer Europe, and that they're terribly evil, and that therefore we must support our European leaders to the end, so they can keep sucking from the European teat. But really that means sucking from all of us, draining our blood through taxes and so on and so forth. And in this way also justifying austerity measures, to put it mildly, that is, impoverishment measures. Because of course it's the Russians who are driving Europe into poverty, not the European leaders. That's the reality. So, well, I understand that for them it's an existential matter.
Meanwhile, on the military front, dear Fernando, yesterday, Russia launched a massive air attack against Kyiv above all, although there were also some attacks on Odessa, around 500 in total, mostly, as always, with drones, but also with missiles. And this is the situation on the ground, in Pokrovsk. These are the first images of Russian soldiers peacefully walking through the city of Pokrovsk, now conquered.
There you see the Russian soldiers, come on, scared to death. You just have to look at them, sneaking from corner to corner. I mean, because according to Ukrainian media and many Western outlets, which is laughable, it's not that the Russians have taken Pokrovsk and are now calmly strolling around, as you can see in these images, without any concern, because there's no one left. There are no Ukrainians. There are even videos where the few residents still in Pokrovsk greet them and all that, saying things like, "Man, you've finally arrived," and so on.
We're going to present it now as well.
Now we're going to present it, okay? Well, anyway, spoiler alert from me. So, the thing is that Ukrainian media and many European outlets are telling us the following. Not only have the Russians not taken Pokrovsk, but the Ukrainians have launched a counterattack and have practically driven them out.
Careful. Watch out, there's an attack. There's a Russian soldier in danger, huh? There's an attack. Attention. Yes, 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 you can see it. Yes, yes, a masonry attack. Masonry, come on, yes, you can see it.
Look at what the Russian soldier does. He doesn't even pay attention. See, it's like he's saying, damn, I actually feel sorry for him and all that.
Yes, it's a special operation by the GUR, the intelligence service of the Ukrainian armed forces. Here's the other video released today, showing the reaction of the few civilians still remaining in Pokrovsk, openly rejecting the Russians. It's something tremendous, because they're turning against their own.
How they're pelted with stones, how they're booed. Yes, 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 you just have to see it.
From what I've read somewhere, those gentlemen said, "Ah, we were waiting for you. We were waiting for you." That's what I've read somewhere. I don't know a word of Russian, so... But anyway, they go around, already taken.
Well, you see, I mean, just look at the calm with which they go through it. Talking to the civilians who remain, "Thank you very much for coming," and so on. Well, yeah, fine. I mean, here are some graves, who knows who's, probably Ukrainians.
Yeah, but apparently those are from civilians, right? Like made by the locals.
And here you can see it. You just have to look at the fear the civilian population shows toward the Russians. Come on. I mean, it's obvious. They're calmly chatting and, well, saying things like, "Damn, you sure took your time getting here, huh? You could have come earlier. We were already fed up with the Ukrainians." Well, that's the real situation, not the nonsense the Europeans are telling us, which is just delusional. But Korov has been taken for a while now, and in Minograd only a part of the north remains, in a situation where the encirclement is already complete. In other words, it's not even a siege anymore, where a small area of less than a kilometer is only covered by drones. No, not even that, because they've said, look, what for? In fact, the Russians in that sector are already focused on other things. They're advancing toward Dobrofilia, they're already attacking Kirchner. Basically, they're moving on to other things, because what's left there is just being quietly cleared out.
Meanwhile, Zelensky, in a truly unprecedented situation in front of the cameras, surely already seen by Fernando. Please, no spoilers this time, dear Fernando. Okay, I'll be quiet, This, a video, confirmed as authentic, right? One of the many videos from the press conferences held by Zelensky in this selfie-style video format, right? Like filmed from below his here. One of the many videos Zelensky releases every day as part of this Ukrainian propaganda campaign, with plenty of advice from the Pentagon, of course. Here's the video distributed yesterday with his explanations about the negotiations and the supposed Ukrainian successes. Pay attention, because you're about to witness something unprecedented. Pay attention. Okay, I'm starting now. The video is short, just this little bit. Pay attention to Zelensky. Having seen that, Fernando, pay attention. Okay, again, rewind. He's talking to the region, to the nostril, this area here, right? Yes, pay attention, pay attention. Again, let's see. This, really, Fernando, this is authentic. Yes. Again, 1, 2, 3. There, pay attention to the nose. Whoa, let's see.
Vamos a ver.
Ahí en cámara lenta, cámara lenta.
A ver. Ostras.
Let's see. Wow. The first thing to say is the power and speed with which this comes out. I mean, if this hits someone, it knocks them out. It messes them up. So the second thing here, the debate is this really just mucus or something else? And if it is mucus, what's the reason? Is it because he has a cold or because of the use of a white powder that Mr. Zelensky consumes in large quantities?
Que consume el señor Zelensky en grandes cantidades.
But mucus, Fernando, a little bit of snot, or a tiny piece like that, really small, like something not absorbed, precisely of white powder. Also possible.
Efectivamente. De polvo blanco. Efectivamente, que ha quedado ahí en la
White powder, indeed, that's stuck there in his nostril, half glued, and while he's talking, breathing in, breathing out, and all that, well, boom, it comes out.
Bueno, ahí.
Well, there, between Trump with the turkey. And this, Fernando, what a world, huh? Tragicomic.
Pero estos son los que van a...
But are these the ones who are going to beat the Russians, huh?
You are hereby unconditionally pardoned. Praise the Lord.
We have to admit that, yes.
Hay que reconocer que si esto fuera una serie televisiva...
We have to admit that if this were a TV series, Trump's antics would be hilarious, because as a showman, he's excellent. Another matter entirely is that he's the President of the United States. Well, and this one's situation is just pathetic. I mean, this man really, thank goodness he doesn't have much time left. But look at the move. Slow motion replay of the move.
Yeah, kind of gross, but... Well, yeah, because the thing is, snorting cocaine. Exactly.
Look, it's not just any bit of mucus or speck of white dust. It's mucus or white dust from Zelensky, who's an important figure. I mean, if this happened to us, well, whatever, it wouldn't matter much. But it happens to Zelensky. So I think that for those of us watching, given the news value, we're able to hold back our disgust at this incident. A perfectly understandable disgust.
Yes, on the other hand, the wreckers already seem used to this kind of image. The other day, Fernando, when you were leaning forward, looking for information on one of your... Yes, at one point, an enlarged image of your nostrils appeared. By the way, very clean, Fernando. Enviably clean. I'm always congested here.
No, I try as much as I can to keep it clean, because of course if I do this, right, let's see, the nostrils, can you see anything white?
No.
Nothing, no, nothing white. Good Lord.
To wrap this up, we're already at the joking stage, Fernando. To sum up, yes, spectacular images. They're generating them too, right? Well, a naturally tragic situation, but still spectacular. These images of the terrible fire still ongoing in Hong Kong. A fire in a skyscraper. And, due to the characteristics of skyscrapers, the fire suppression systems, those pipes with sprinkler-like devices, are trying to respond to the blaze. If they don't respond effectively, the firefighters can't do much more than carry out this task, putting out the fire as far as their hoses and water can reach. Here, clearly visible in these images, a little further down, they can reach up to the 20th or 30th floor. Beyond that, they can't go any higher. They can only witness this tragic scene, which has sadly already claimed the lives of 36 people in these residential skyscrapers in Hong Kong. 36 people, and many more, dozens, are still reported missing or unaccounted for, most likely still inside these buildings.
Claro, se sabe el origen.
Do we know how it happened? Yes, it started at the Wangfuk Court around 2:51 p.m. local time. The complex consists of 2,000 housing units spread across 8 blocks, with more than 4,600 residents. According to reports, it apparently was a fire linked to an accident. For now, I don't recall seeing any news, much less anything suggesting an attack or something like that. But anyway, it started in one place, spread to another, then to the whole building, then to the adjacent skyscraper, and from there to the entire complex.
Claro, Hong Kong, como sabéis, antigua colonia británica.
Hong Kong, as you know, a former British colony until the 1990s, has all its buildings very close together. And what most likely happened is that the fire spread from one building to another because they're so close to each other. And that has caused, as you can see here, several buildings to catch fire. In fact, the Chinese are developing and have already started to implement, though there's still a long way to go, firefighting with drones. That is, they take a drone, a quadcopter for example, which carries a hose, it flies up high, the hose opens, and the quadcopter sprays the water, distributing it over the area that's on fire. But of course, we're talking about skyscrapers with many floors, and it's very complicated. And as I said, there has been a lot of renovation in Hong Kong.
Se ha hecho mucha renovación. Los chinos, había un barrio, no me acuerdo el nombre, un barrio, en fin.
There was a neighborhood, I can't remember the name, a massive construction built completely spontaneously, with buildings almost like shanties, but many stories high where, well, they were all connected internally because it was one block, a huge block where tens of thousands of people lived. It covered several soccer fields and so on. And that, for example, was torn down because it was a fire hazard and everything else, really. But partly a legacy of the British, because let's not forget that Hong Kong has had to compress its population into a very small area, which is Hong Kong, with a lot of people and very little space. So you have no choice but to build skyscrapers.
Yes. Hong Kong, let's remember, a British colony, handed over or returned in 91 or 94. I don't remember exactly now. Yes, around that time. Something similar to Macau, a Portuguese colony not far from there, but much less important, right?
Yes. Besides, I remember that the British, who are quite funny, had Hong Kong leased for 100 years. They had to give it back because the lease was up. Well, during those 100 years, they hadn't carried out any democratization process in Hong Kong until the last 3 or 4 years, when they already knew they had to hand it over to the Chinese. Then they set up a parliament and some elections and all that, but before that, they never did. What a coincidence, huh? The things the British do. Anyway, it's the same old story. The British always criticizing others for not doing things they don't do themselves.
Yes, wherever the British Empire has set foot, it has sown death and destruction throughout history, without a doubt. Dear Fernando, let's wrap up this broadcast here. In 15 minutes, Eduardo Vior begins with his program on DMP geopolitics, rebroadcast on our channel. Don't miss it. From African blood, the Arab Emirates extract gold. An interesting topic for tonight. Tomorrow, as always, will be live, and on Friday, once again, already confirmed, Juan Antonio Aguilar. And on Friday, Fernando's program at 11, European time, on DMP Geopolitics. That's right, dear Fernando, 1,000 thanks, as always. To Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, as always, 1,000 thanks, Beatriz, and to all the demolishers. Now, Eduardo Vior's program, and we'll be back here tomorrow. Until next time.
Hasta la próxima. Chau, chau.
Hasta luego.
Bye-bye. See you later.
it.